Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Beyond Alley podcast, hosted by Omni Bridgeway, one of the world's most experienced dispute funders and enforcement specialists. Our podcast focuses on commercial disputes around the globe and innovative ways to maximize value for clients and law firms. Episodes of this podcast can be found on our website, www.omnibridgeway.com, and also via iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast networks. We welcome you to subscribe to the podcast and leave us reviews. My name is Justin McClernand, and I'm your host for today's podcast, Third-Party Funding, Law, Economics and Policy. I'm an investment manager based in Omni Bridgeway's Perth office. My role at Omni Bridgeway is to source and evaluate potential case investments and manage those which are approved for funding through to resolution. I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague, Gian Marco Solas. Gian Marco is based in Amsterdam, where he is a legal and business development counsel with Omni Bridgeway. Before working for Omni Bridgeway, Gian Marco qualified as an Italian EU lawyer and worked for national and international law firms, different businesses, and in the EU Commission. Gian Marco holds a joint PhD with a thesis on the law and economics of third-party funding. He has also authored a book called Third-Party Funding, Law, Economics and Policy, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. Gian Marco's book, for the first time, describes third-party funding as a standalone practice within the wider litigation and legal services markets. The book considers legal issues related to third-party funding in both common law and civil law jurisdictions, and in the international context. It also discusses the incentives and economics of funding transactions in different legal contexts, how third-party funding emerged, and how it is likely to develop, and also offers practical insights into third-party funding transactions. In this podcast, Gian Marco will share with us the background to the book and discuss some of his analysis and views of third-party funding, which are dealt with in detail in the book. Gian Marco, welcome to the Beyond Alley podcast.
Thanks, Justin.
Why don't we kick things off by you giving our listeners a little bit of background about your career in the law prior to your making the move to Omni Bridgeway?
After law school, I started private practice in a Italian commercial litigation law firm. But at the time, everyone was talking already how the legal profession changed in the coming years. I wasn't sure whether that was my career, and that is why I tried alternative paths, such as setting up some businesses or doing some periods at European institutions. And then I decided to do a PhD when I came across the topic of third-party funding.
Okay, well, that certainly sounds like you had quite a diverse career in law and business. But I'm curious, what was it that drew you away from that practice and doing the things that you were interested in exploring and making the decision to go to work for a disputes financier?
It was 2014. I was in Gians, Brussels, and I had already started at the time a PhD in litigation funding, but I wasn't convinced much that there was the right path to follow. No one really knew about this topic. But I had talked at the time with a known partner of the litigation department of Gians, and she sort of convinced me to pursue this road, that she thought that was the future of private practice. Therefore, I have left the private practice, concentrated on the PhD and on the book, and at some point I started brokering some deals to third-party funders, which then allowed me to join one of them.
I see. Thanks, Gian Marco. And we'll touch on the book that you mentioned shortly. But first, in relation to your current role as legal counsel with Omni Bridgeway, can you tell us a little bit about your chief responsibilities and, I guess, what does a typical day in the office look like for you?
Omni Bridgeway right now, I'm quite involved in the collective redress proceedings and in all the third-party funded matters. But let's say on a daily basis, I mainly deal with the book building, so with the legal and business aspects of the truck cartel litigation we're dealing with. So my role entails, encompasses all my previous background, which was made of both legal and business experiences, and it allows me to develop the business of Omni Bridgeway, particularly in the context of the collective redress practice.
I see. And so you mentioned it just before, but let's have a discussion now about a recent addition to your publishing credentials. I understand you've written a book on disputes funding titled Third Party Funding Law, Economics and Policy. So, Gian Marco, firstly, how did this book come to be?
When I learned about the practice of third-party funding, I thought, well, I tried to search something about it, and there was nothing written on the topic. And I said, well, probably this could be a good way to approach the matter, to start researching something. And then the fact that there was no written book, or particularly not describing this practice thoroughly from a civil law perspective, there was the moment when I thought, well, I should probably do something myself, which would be also a way to, for the future, differentiate myself in the market.
And who do you see as the target audience for the book, Gian Marco? Is it intended for legal professionals to read, corporate executives and decision makers in corporations, or is it more of an academic treatise? Who do you think would find it most helpful or say, in practice, most useful to read your book?
The same fact that his first book describing the matter made it a very general book. For this reason, I think it can certainly be helpful for lawyers and practitioners, but more in general for anyone who wants to learn about the practice, from academics to or representative organizations and corporate executives that want to learn more about third-party funding and how that could be useful for their practice. However, the same fact that it's a generalist book, it does not allow to enter into details of single deals. And in that case, I think further research will be needed.
I see. And one of the topics your book covers in some detail is the history of third-party funding, which I guess ties in with, providing that background, high-level overview of third-party funding. And you discuss and compare how it's been used in a number of common law and civil law jurisdictions. What are the jurisdictions that you included and why did you choose them?
So I think starting from the historical part, it was a very interesting one to learn how the practice evolved in the past and how that led to some prohibitions or limits to third-party funding. Relying on the study of these prohibitions or limits, then the market has developed in the recent years in certain jurisdictions. So for the comparative legal part, I took into account those countries where, let's say, the historical limitations and prohibitions of third-party funding have not prevented this practice to emerge. And therefore, I've taken into account all those countries where third-party funding had actually emerged, and there was some case law or regulation that could, let's say, have implications for this practice.
I see. And I'm also interested in your chapter about what you discern to be the social impact of third-party funding from, I guess, numerous perspectives, the claimant, defendants, the legal system, and then looking at the impact on society more broadly. Could you tell us a little about what you consider to be the main societal impacts of third-party funding, Gian Marco?
Yeah, generally when people talk about social impact of third-party funding, they focus on access to justice. The more I am into this practice, the more I think that the biggest, let's say, positive social impact of third-party funding is the increase in the probability to obtain recovery. Clients do not want to only have access to justice. Very often our clients can access to justice themselves, but they want a series of skills and, of course, experience, management experience that will lead them to recovery. This is something I've learned right now at Omni Bridgeway, and I think that is the key positive aspect of this practice, particularly if you look at it from a more general social perspective.
And Gian Marco, you mentioned, the real focus on society, I guess, benefiting from third-party funding is the recovery side of things. Are you referring in particular there to asset tracing and enforcement as opposed to funding of the litigation and the claims generally?
I think I'm referring to a combination to all of them, meaning that I think that the funding side only is not sufficient to necessarily achieve the client's desired outcome, but it comes with a series of skills that are necessary to then deliver what the clients expect. And that is, of course, the asset tracing and then the management skills we have, but also the way at the beginning we help the client take the right decision and their lawyers to take the right decision to pursue the litigation.
I understand. And your book also covers some of the contractual, regulatory and policy considerations in disputes funding. And there's a section in which you talk about certain issues that can and do arise during funded proceedings. For example, you discuss conflicts between parties and the issue of disclosing the funding relationship and the terms of the funding relationship to the court and to other stakeholders, I guess. Could you perhaps select one or two of those issues and briefly tell us about them?
So in terms of regulation of third-party funding, I conclude that for a moment, as the market is not mature, a hard regulation will be undesirable because it will hamper the market to develop and to also, let's say, produce the positive effects that this market might have that I described in the chapter about the social impact of third-party funding. Therefore, the ultimate proposal was to have some form of regulation or soft regulation that will prevent that some conflicts might arise while allowing the market to develop.
Does that refer to external regulation by government and other instrumentalities, or is it a combination of that and, effectively the participants in the market regulating the market themselves?
Well, for the moment, as the market is not mature, certainly any form of hard regulation will prevent this market to develop and therefore to also have the positive effect this market would entail, particularly those that I try to describe in the general positive social impact of third-party funding chapter. Therefore, forms of soft, light regulation will certainly to be welcomed, but more to guide the operators in how to structure these deals and to make them legal. And that is important everywhere, but I think it is even more important in civil law or jurisdictions where contractual structures of third-party funding, or many other contracts in general might determine that one contract is valid or not, and therefore the way in which these deals might be structured could obviously entail a result or another depending on of the chosen contractual form.
We're almost out of time, but very briefly, Gian Marco, you discussed the future of litigation funding market in your book. I'm curious as to what you think the future holds for the market.
Well, I think there will be a period of, let's say, 10, 15 years where this practice will develop. But if I try to look beyond that, what I could see is that this practice will certainly have a big impact in the change in the legal practice, and particularly if combined with other spheres of business, such as those that concern technology and artificial intelligence. But at the center of all this, I think there will always be the figure of lawyers that will somehow be the recipients and the drivers of this change, and we will certainly have to cooperate with the lawyers to drive this change in a way that it will not only improve businesses but also the correct application of the law.
Gian Marco, thanks. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today and to introduce you to our audience. What's the best way for listeners to contact you if they have questions, and also how do they get your book?
Well, people can contact me at my LinkedIn profile, but also through the website of Omni Bridgeway.
Thank you very much, Gian Marco. That concludes this episode. As I mentioned at the outset, episodes of the Beyond Hourly podcast can be found on our website, www.omnibridgeway.com, and also via iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast networks. I invite you to subscribe and leave us reviews. You can also access a transcript of this podcast on our website blog page. Please feel free to follow up with me, Justin McClernand, at jmcclernand@omnibridgeway.com for any feedback, ideas, or insights you have on topics we should cover on the podcast. We'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, thanks for listening and goodbye.